We're going to begin the evening with a thought provoking presentation by Dr. Andrew Thompson. Dr. Thompson is a developmental toxicologist who tries to understand how environmental chemicals can impact our aquatic life. Andrew is the proud father of twins, and their existence has led to his only hobby being that of sleep. In his presentation tonight, Andrew asks, what happens when neuroactive compounds from our antidepressants are not fully degraded and actually end up in our wastewater? And what impact might this have on our aquatic ecosystems? Join me now in welcoming our first speaker, Dr. Andrew Thompson.
Thank you, Katie. Sad but true. That is actually my only hobby these days. And what I'm actually going to be talking to you about is a lot of based on my doctoral work. And I'm going to try and convince you that there is more than just the price you see on an antidepressant bottle. There might be an environmental cost with our usage of these pills. My work basically started because of the pervasive issue of depression. Mental health is a huge issue for the planet. If we consider how many people are actually affected by mental health, we expect it to be higher than 250 million people globally. That's a staggering number. And we actually have to consider the stigma of it, where it's not really talked about, it's not really acknowledged. We kind of leave it to the side because we don't really want to deal with it. And it's a sensitive issue for a lot of people. And particularly in academia and in schools in general, a lot of it is overlooked, and a large proportion of the population is expected to have some sort of mental health disorder. Approximately 15% of North Americans turn to antidepressants when they have mental health issues. And why wouldn't you? We take these neuroactive compounds to elicit changes in our brain that bring us back to normal. They cease this debilitating disease that afflicts us. This is actually from a Colgate commercial, but the premise is the same, where you take these pills to be happier. But there was actually an issue with my previous slide, because I actually made that in 2015. And I like showing that slide because this is when I really started my doctoral program. And that number has changed. It's actually gone up to 5% depending on where we look. And it's closer to 18 to 20% of North Americans use antidepressants. And that number has largely increased lately due to the thing you may have heard of, the pandemic that ended all of our lives for almost a year. But we have to consider that now we have antidepressants globally. Doctors are prescribing these pills in nearly every country that I can really think of, in Europe, in North America, South America, and so on. And we're using these pills to treat a wide variety of conditions, including seniors and children. So as these drugs have increased their prescription rate and their usage is now higher, we have to consider what's actually happening. These pills are done for this constant battle of light and dark, this chasing of happiness versus this debilitating disease that afflicts us in depression. And behind the scenes, we're actually being betrayed by our closest friend who's seen us in our darkest moments. That's right, the toilet. The toilet has seen you at your worst. And unfortunately, these neuroactive compounds that we take willingly don't actually fully get degraded by our body. We don't break them down fully. And as a result, we're finding them in aquatic habitats because our wastewater system doesn't fully remove them. So we take these pills, they don't fully break down, our friend betrays us, and now we have these contaminants in our water. And in the water, we have to start asking, if they're there, what are the impacts to aquatic life? And as a developmental toxicologist, I have a preference to look at fish, and they're a really good marker of the health of our aquatic ecosystems. And when we think of what we could actually be looking at, we have to look at the fact that we take these pills to be neuroactive in us. And I want you to take just a second here and to look at this video. This is just a demonstration of every neuron being born in a zebrafish, which is a type of fish, a model that I use for a lot of my research. And every lesson that we gain from this animal, we learn that the systems that we share, this neuroanatomy, this neurobiology, is very similar. And what I like to do is to look at the neurobiology in terms of how it could be affected by something like antidepressants, and then see how does that translate from that early system to later behavioral differences that we may see. And this is just an example of some of the data points that I've generated. What you're looking at is basically anything that you can see is green is serotonin in the brain of a zebrafish. And after I've exposed them to the antidepressant, it's like I've turned off the lights. There is an image there. I did not make a mistake. It is functionally there, but we've reduced the amount of serotonin in the brain by exposing them to an antidepressant. This is an extreme dosage, but this just shows the capacity of this drug in early life. And I also kind of segued that to see how does this affect neurodevelopment? And if we see these changes in serotonin, is there a change in the way that we can actually see the brain growing? And what you're seeing here is actually unexposed fish for dopamine cells versus when they've exposed to Effexor, which is one of the more common antidepressants globally. We actually see a reduction in the amount of neurons formed as a result of exposure to this drug. So we see these changes in antidepressants, or antidepressants causing these changes in the brain. And then we have to start asking the question, what does this actually mean for animal function? So looking at some of the cascades or some of the regions that were heavily impacted by these drugs, which were the hypothalamus and the pituitary, we started to ask the question, what systems that these regions govern, are they changed as well? And we looked at things like growth, and this was more of a research search that we did. We found that environmental levels of antidepressants globally, not even just the ones that I looked at, were sufficiently high enough to reduce growth in fish, in a variety of different fish. So we're seeing this commonality where there's this reduction in their growth rate following exposure. Furthermore, when we look at things like reproduction and development, these antidepressants alter these simple systems. So the way this basic endocrinology that allows them to reproduce, hormones change, development of the actual gonad changes following exposure to the antidepressant. When we look at something like stress, and we all are stressed. I'm stressed right now speaking to you. Cortisol, which is this main hormone that mediates how we actually respond to changes in our life, to stressors in our environment, the development of the system and the response of it is actually diminished following antidepressant exposure. So the capacity of these antidepressants is to actually change the basic endocrinology of fish. But I mentioned before that I really like looking at behavior. So we see this huge change in their neurobiology. We see this change in their endocrine systems. What does this mean for how they actually function? And in fish, you can't really go up to them and ask, hey, how are you doing? You stressed? Me? We can look at things like courtship. So this is actually how they would interact, as you can imagine, to actually breed. And antidepressants at environmental levels are sufficient to actually change how they would respond in terms of courting a mate. We look at things like foraging. They can't go to Fortinos like we can. They actually have to hunt food. They have to have this drive to eat. And both of those are reduced following antidepressant exposure. And we have to look at anxiety-like behavior. And I say anxiety-like because I can't actually ask how they're doing in terms of anxiety. So anxiety-like behavior will be how they actually avoid predation or how they hide. And what we see is that antidepressants at current environmental levels can actually sufficiently change these anxiety-like behaviors. So in general, the levels that we see now are sufficient to actually change the behavioral responses. And when we take this back to the start and we try to bring it all together and we look at ourselves in the mirror, we have to see that there's other animals too that share the same neuroanatomy, the same neurobiology, and are affected by the same drugs that we take to chase happiness. And we have to start to see, well, these antidepressant levels are so high and they're getting only higher because we're increasing usage. Is this going to start to impact the biodiversity of the planet that we all are almost tasked to protect? And that kind of leads me to the next point. What are we doing with antidepressants? Because as more and more studies come out, we are prescribing these at a rapid rate. And in a lot of cases, the studies show they're not as effective. And we're prescribing them for nearly things that, in terms of mild depression and moderate cases of depression, that several studies have suggested that therapy is much more effective to work on. So maybe it's time for a gut check and for us to see if we have to start as a society, start to reinvest in therapy for everyone. And I hope I've at least raised some provocation in your mind that it's not just antidepressant, or the price on the antidepressant bottle is all we have to pay. Because if these trends keep going, we have the potential to have an environmental cost that humanity is not willing to pay. And I recently published an op-ed in The Conversation. If you'd like to read more, there's links to publications in that, and I'll take any questions you have, either by email or now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Thompson. Such fascinating and really important research that you're doing. Now, we have a question from the audience. Can the results of your study potentially translate to non aquatic mammals, including ourselves, humans? And if so, how?
Thank you for the question. Unsurprisingly, that's one I've heard a lot. And the short answer is no. I mean, the dosages that I've used are much higher than we would expect to see. And they were given in a very different environment where it's something like a zebrafish, they have a maternal deposit in the egg, and then that's it for the maternal influences. They're almost devoid for the rest of their development. Versus in humans, where there's this consistent uh, uh, interaction with the mother in terms of the fetus. But we also have to take into the fact that maybe we're not going to see the same levels of extremes, but everything we've kind of looked at, all these endocrine changes, all these behavioral changes, that's what we take the pills for. And if you look at things like hormonal changes, those are very common side effects of antidepressants, including things like sexual dysfunction and changes in growth. So antidepressants have the capacity to do that. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't be taking pills, but I'm saying that we should be paying attention to what they're doing. And you should really have the information from your doctor to make really educated choices.
Well said. Thank you so much, Dr. Thompson. So, looking at your presentation, is there potentially a wastewater treatment option when we're talking about these neurochemicals that we have in our wastewater?
There's a lot of labs that are actually trying to use different techniques to treat wastewater. In terms of adverse effects, or actually removing like things like antidepressants, they're actually highly effective, but they're really expensive for us to implement on a large scale, considering how much we go to the washroom. So this is one of the things that, like, in terms of feasibility, we don't really have any current options, but we're always working towards it. But some of the techniques, and I showed a lot of adverse effects. Where actually we had a collaboration with a group from Tel Aviv, where we were able to use an ozonated compound, so they actually apply ozone to wastewater, and they were able to basically alter the antidepressant, and it ameliorated or removed the effect. So we were actually able to recover and rescue the negative connotation towards the animal, which is pretty cool.
Very cool. Thank you so much, Dr. Thompson.